Hi, I'm Dr. Bob Weathers, and I'm here today to talk about 7 keys to mastering the doctoral project. I'd like to focus several key principles today in and around chapters 4 and 5 of the doctoral project. And I want to say a little bit about what I plan to accomplish and also what I plan not to accomplish. I've worked over the last 30 years. I've chaired several dozen doctoral dissertations, and I've served on many more dozen doctoral dissertation committees. Before I did that, I completed a doctoral dissertation. I actually brought it in here today. This is my dissertation. And what I'm interested in doing is calling on whatever I've learned, what I know by heart from this experience of my own surviving this, as well as aiding other learners, other students with the process. And whatever of this applies, that's helpful. That's my aim. I've been very involved at Cal Southern in writing and rewriting the doctoral project manual. I worked closely with Dr. Grimes, our dean, with Dr. Linda Fisher from USC, Drs. Diltz Harriman and Dr. Andrews from Cal Southern. We worked closely on this. And it's an abundantly valuable resource with checklists and templates and outlines, and I refer you to that. I won't be covering that today. That might be the subject of another conversation for sure. I'll be referencing it, but I won't be going into detail there. I'll come back to this at the end, but that's not what I'm going to be doing today. What I want to do today is take a slightly different direction. And I want to ground what I think that makes for moving through the doctoral project process mentally and even emotionally, what makes that not only livable but even thrivable. I loved my dissertation. I've worked with a number of students over the years that have loved theirs. I've also worked with some that didn't, so let's keep it real. But what I'm interested in doing is providing some tips that will help both learners and mentors navigate this process. It's an immensely important life process, and I support it as such. I'm going to ground what I talk about today in personal examples, both from my own dissertation process 35 years ago, as well as the last 30 years of chairing dissertations. And finally, I'm working on a project right now that I've been working on for the last couple of years, and it might as well be a doctoral project. And I'll tie this into my first point in just a moment, but I'll be referencing the content of what it is, the project I'm working on right now, which mirrors in many ways, really kind of point for point, the unfolding of a doctoral project. I've come up with 7 keys. This is key number 1 here. I call it no wasted motion. I remember there was a year that I set aside in the early 1980s where all I did is I read. And I started reading. My dissertation was in the area of mindfulness meditation. And I started from scratch. I just started reading. I didn't have any questions. I just wanted to see what was out there. And I remember that year I read 50 books. That's the most books I've ever read in a year. They were all in this area. So I moved from being a novice to being somewhat oriented. And then I read a few hundred articles over the course of that time. And over the course of that year, what formed was the lay of the land, and questions began to emerge organically. I'm sure there's different ways to do research. That's how I did it. And what came out of that was a question that no one had studied, and that became the subject of my dissertation. In the process of reading those 50 books and a few hundred articles, in my actual dissertation, I didn't include but a mere fraction of those. This refers to something you mentioned earlier, Jim. And when I say there's no wasted motion, everything that I wrote or have written or have taught, it relies on everything I've read. It's just that when it comes down to writing a doctoral project, please know ahead of time that you'll be paring back all the way along. We'll be talking about subtracting a little bit later on. But don't consider it wasted. If you read articles that you don't actually use, what those did is those headed you in the direction of where you are right now. So I want to honor this process. There is a natural process of working our way through a lot of work, and it is rolling up your sleeves and getting down to business. But I don't consider anything that I do including in the research process. And I don't want you to either as a waste of time. I just don't really see it that way, and I don't think it's a useful way of viewing your labors. I feel the same thing about drafts that I've written. I'll give you an example. The project that I'm working on in the last year or two, I started very similarly. I just started reading in the area of addiction and recovery and discovered soon enough, I'm very interested in the treatment of recovery, that there are barriers to treatment. The way this goes is that 1 out of 10 Americans are clinically addicted to something. We were just talking about this earlier. But out of that 10% of Americans that are addicted, only 1% of Americans find treatment in any given year. So that means 9% of those that are afflicted with a clinically diagnosable addiction don't find treatment. And so I've been particularly interested in what are the barriers to people finding treatment when they're clearly in trouble. And what's emerged out of that are various theories and various research findings. And as I followed this, I also found myself very interested in a companion area, which is looking at the biology, the brain and addiction. That's just a career-long interest of mine is neuroscience. And only in the last 6 months has there been a convergence between this one area, which is why don't people seek treatment, and the science of addiction, or the brain biology of addiction, and that's become the subject of my work these days, and I'll reference this as we move along. But what I want to say around not only the articles I've read so many articles that I'm not currently using, and they're sitting there, and I may come back to them, but they helped get me to where I am right now, that's for sure. And also, I've written multiple drafts of the material that I'm working on right now. It started with blogs and notes to myself, and then it turned into proposals for presentations and actual presentations. But any of us that present, any of us that write, know how that goes, is that I have draft after draft after draft where it gets modified and changed. And I haven't done this, but if I were to go back to what I was writing 6 months ago, it would be unrecognizable with what I'm doing right now. And yet I don't feel like that one of those drafts was a waste of time. Same deal, no wasted motion with what we write. I don't see dead ends in this. It's like, okay, that didn't work, let's try another angle. To tie this specifically into our doctoral project process here at Cal Southern, Chapter 4 addresses the results section. I'll be talking more about this as I move through these other 6 points coming up. But let me just mention this now. In reporting results, you might find it to be frustrating, but you're not required to report all your results in Chapter 4. In other words, you'll find results that are not pertinent, that don't relate to your research questions, etc. And it really doesn't serve to be exhaustive, okay? Because that's exhausting. It really serves to be parsimonious, to be choosing, and to be able to let go, to realize if I pick 4 or 5 results that are really salient, and I can really, that's where the maximum oomph is, let me pour my energy into that and let the others go. So in the very same spirit, no wasted motion, you'll generate way more results than will be useful or usable in your doctoral project. And who knows, maybe you'll spin off on those later, but conciseness, you used the word succinctness earlier, really is the order of the day. While I'm thinking of it, Chapter 5, which is the discussion section, about which I'll be talking a bit more too, it's not necessary to discuss every single implication of what you find in your dissertation or doctoral project results in Chapter 5. In fact, again, that can also be a deluge and be overwhelming, and it can dilute the importance of what it is that you want to emphasize. And so I really advise, both in Chapter 4 and Chapter 5, to pare back. And we'll be talking about less is more in a few minutes. But for now, just to say that just because you pare back findings or you pare back suggestions or implications in your discussion section, that's not a loss. It's learning to let go. And so you can see that completing a doctoral project has as much to do with our personal psychologies, our mental processes, as it does with the substance or the material of our study. The second key is really the core of my presentation to you all today, and this has to do with the right and the left brain. Just up the road at UCLA, Dan Siegel is doing brain research along with his companions up there, Marco Iacoboni and Alan Shore, Jeffrey Schwartz. What's happening in terms of brain studies is radical in the last 10 years, unbelievable. It's part of what's piqued my interest in applying it to addiction and recovery, because we now know what goes on in the brain of an addict that was not possible as recently as 10 years ago. It's really incredible. Dan Siegel has written a lot in his multiple books about the difference between left and right brain, and I like his summary of it. The left brain, most of us know this from our studies, and if not from that, just from the media. But in his concise way of putting it, the left brain really focuses on what's logical. It tends to move through thought process in a linear way. It tends to be more focused on language. Literally, the left temporal lobe is the seat of language, and the left brain is really logical, linear, and linguistic. How's that? And the right brain, on the other hand, is oriented towards intuition. It tends to be more intuitive. Rather than being just linear, it tends to be holistic. And so it tends to be embracing of apparent opposites, very different than what the left brain does, straight line thinking. And thirdly, the right brain, rather than operating primarily in language, operates primarily in image. It's imagistic. It's more spatial. It's more metaphoric. So we all have a felt sense of that difference. Well, Bob Weathers has come up with the conclusion over the last period of time that this is a helpful way to distinguish between chapters 4 and 5. Okay. I want to suggest, just for our consideration, that chapter 4 is primarily a left brain exercise, and I intend to defend that over the next few minutes. I won't arm wrestle anybody over this, but I think it can be used as an analogy. And that chapter 5 really requires a different part of the brain, namely the right brain, and we'll see how this unfolds. Chapter 4, in terms of reporting results, I wrote a qualitative dissertation, and I gathered all kinds of data, and about 300 of these 400 pages is my results section, where I'm just reporting, because I had lengthy interviews, it's just reporting the results of the interviews. There's no interpretation. It's meant to be very terse, very scientific. To the point, and there's not to be any ornamentation, no explanation, no discussion. That's to be saved for chapter 5. And this is the sense that I mean that chapter 4 is primarily about language, logic, and linearity, the left brain. Chapter 5, on the other hand, including in my dissertation, is an explanation of what the heck is all of this, what is all this data, what do all these data imply? What do they suggest? And that really requires stepping back from the grid and being able to interpret. And interpretation is really primarily a function of the right hemisphere, to be able to understand, to synthesize. The left brain analyzes, breaks things into bits. The right brain synthesizes, pulls together holistic pieces of information and forms connections. And so that's what the 5th chapter is for our doctoral projects here at Cal Southern. Let me say a little bit more about chapter 4 in the left brain. I have to tell you that when I was in graduate school, there was a building near the graduate school, and I walked by this building most every day, and there was a plaque on the wall. I was recently in Pasadena where I went to school, and I drove by to see if the plaque was still there. It still is there. It's pretty amazing all these years later. And the plaque was a quotation by Louis Pasteur, and it inspired me. I have an emotional response to it even now, and it's a familiar quote, but it was on a medical building, and you'll see the application, and the quote was this: "In the fields of observation, chance favors only the mind which is prepared." And I thought of that when I began graduate school, because I figured that I needed a fair bit of preparation, because doing clinical work felt very chancy to me, and I needed all the help I could get. In the fields of observation, chance favors only the mind which is prepared. The mind which is prepared is really the left brain work of rolling up our sleeves and working our hind sections off to learn the material. In the realm of music, it's the 5-finger exercises. I'm a drummer. There are 26 rudiments in drumming. For the first 5 years that I drummed, all I played were 26 rudiments. And it was doing that preparation that provided for the opportunity then to improvise and create, which would be what Pasteur means by chance. Yeah, by chance. just to give you a sense of how this will work for you all in the process of doing your doctoral projects and how it's going for me in my current project that I've been working on for the last year or two. I just gave a presentation at a university 2 weeks ago, and I supplied the audience a reference list. Here it is. It's just 2 pages of what I felt like were the most important books I've read in the last 2 years, and I highlighted the 12 most important. I wanted to give the audience, because this was an audience of psychologists that might be interested. This represents, this is 5-finger exercises. This is where you sit in the library, you sit in your office, and you just work through books. And in some of these books, I read them twice, just notes, trying to get this material inside. And if it's material that enlivens you, it's not as dreadful as it sounds. You have to be passionate about it. I am passionate about it. But sometimes, it's just not what you want to do. You just want to unplug and chill. This is the work that's required in order to be prepared in the way that Pasteur says. In our textbooks for the doctoral project sequence, we have a number of textbooks that are classic fulfill. I have Cresswell here, which is on research design, particularly applicable to our introducing now the qualitative research project as a possibility for our doctoral students. This is not fun reading, unless you're a methodologist like Linda. But it's very, very important that you do the reading. The same with these other textbooks. We have a book on research design, a book on preparing lit reviews, which is excellent for those of you that are completing a theoretical doctoral project. You need to know this material. I won't have the opportunity today to go into how you do a case study analysis or how you do a phenomenological dissertation. I don't have the time to do that. These books will be what you need to read, and you'll be working with your mentor and your committee members to accomplish this. But there's no getting around it. You've got to do the work. You've got to do the work. That's the left brain. But the left brain isn't sufficient. I told you I'm a drummer. I'm a jazz drummer, and one of my mentors in jazz, I wish, is the great jazz saxophonist Charlie Parker. And I love what Charlie Parker said about Chapter 5. He didn't realize it at the time, but he was. He said, if you don't live it, your horn won't play it. If you don't live it, your horn won't play it. And the fact is that Charlie Parker and all the rest of us, we have to do our scales. We have to memorize. We have to do our drum rudiments, our 5-finger exercises. We have to read. We have to do all of this work. But if that's all you do, then you end up, just reminds me of another quote from a jazz bass player, Charlie Mingus. He said there are 2 kinds of musicians. There are stenographers and there are artists. And if all you do is the left brain, you end up being a stenographer. And that will ill serve you. What's required is to be really good at stenography, to know your technique cold, to get your information in hand, to get your left brain in order. But what's required is the corpus callosum is what connects our left and right brains. We have to connect through our corpus callosum to the right brain. And it's the right brain that gets at what Charlie Parker was saying. He says, you've got to live this. And if you don't live it, your dissertation, your doctoral project, whatever you're working on in your life, it'll show. It'll show. You've got to live it in order for your horn to play it. And let me give you a suggestion, a practical suggestion. This is a confession. How I read articles, psychology articles, when I'm in a hurry, is that, and I usually am, if I need to cover through a lot of articles quickly and then later pick the ones that I want to go more in depth, what I will do, my cheat, is that I'll read the abstract to begin with, to get the lay of the land, and then I'll cut to the chase, and I'll read chapters 4 and 5 in an article, which in essence is I'll read the results section, find out what they found in that terse, oftentimes statistical language, and then I'll read the discussion section. I want to know what their left and right brain say about what's going on. And then I'll go back and read the lit review and the methodology later if it's an important article to me. I suggest you do this, as it was suggested by you, Dr. Shaw. I suggest that you do this as a learner, is read 10 articles today, tomorrow. Read through 10 articles and see if I'm wrong about this, is that you'll find the format, one article after another, after the topic has been introduced, after the literature has been reviewed and the methodology has been named is that in those 4th and 5th chapters, I'm biased because I think those are the most important ones, is that you'll have very terse, concise scientific language to explain the results, no filigree, and then the 5th chapter, or the discussion section, will be all of the meat. That'll be all the creativity, and both are required. Both left and right brain are required. Let me say one last thing, is that there are 2 common pitfalls, the 2 most common pitfalls, I think, in the doctoral project process. This is over all the years, in my experience, is that students will commit one of 2 errors. The first one is that they'll land on the left brain and stay there. The other is that they'll move too quickly to the right brain and miss the left brain. And so let me talk about the latter first. A lot of people coming into psychology aren't that oriented towards the left brain necessarily. They have a lot of emphasis on mental processes, psychological self-reflection, even emotional awareness, and so on. And so when it comes to being scientific and being very rigorous and hyper-objective about reporting results, there's nothing that romantic about it. And so one of the temptations is to move right through that and too quickly, and then move into how this is going to change the world. And unfortunately, that means where the 4th chapter, the results section, is given short shrift in favor of moving into the discussion section, because that's where the person can really expand and flower. Unfortunately, what that does is it ill serves the 5th chapter, because then there's not enough of a logical, empirical basis for the assertions that are being made, the claims that are being made in the 5th chapter. So don't do that. Don't do that. That's not okay. I actually have found more common, though, the other problem, which is, and I think this is understandable, is that students, learners will move through the 1st chapter, the 2nd chapter, 3rd chapter, they'll do their research, they'll report their results, and then they will fizzle out. And so you'll end up with this huge anticlimactic little tiny chapter 5 that doesn't really get, the student doesn't get to shine. They've worked for a year or 2 or however long they've worked, and now it just fizzles down. It's a decrescendo, like this. And so I've had to pump a lot of energy into students over the years to make sure that they give full creativity and use their best thinking in chapter 5 to fill out their results in terms of, what are the implications of this? How does this apply to my field? What are some limitations? What would I do differently? How would future research benefit from this? What are some suggestions for future research, etc.? Even kind of integrative conclusions. That's hard work to do when you're burnt out and tired, but please don't do that. Take your vitamins and don't give up on chapter 5, because that's really your climactic, that's your statement. And that really makes the difference, I think, oftentimes for me, between a stellar dissertation or doctoral project and one that's standard, mediocre, but uninspiring. So, okay. Key number 3. These next few I'll move through more quickly. The right and left brain I really wanted to talk about, because I think really what's required of all of us in our lives, in research, and in this case doctoral research. I think this is why the doctoral project is so important. It requires an integration of different parts of ourselves that is not easy. Carl Jung called it the opus contra naturam. It's the work against nature to hold apparent opposites, and that's what's required. Whether you think of it in terms of right or left brain, if you think about it in terms of being logical and linear versus being creative and intuitive. And it's easy to land on one or the other, and most of us do in life. But the doctoral project mandates, by its very structure, that you integrate those opposites. And so that's the work. It ties into the next point, which is key number 3 has to do with creative process. There's one of my favorite authors in psychiatry is Albert Rothenberg from Harvard, who spent a fair bit of his career studying creative process. His term for it is homospatial process. Simple enough. He defines creativity. I think it's a good definition of creativity. It's bringing 2 things that are separate or different into the same space, mental space, things that were never seen as commensurable or integratable before. So it's bringing 2 things into the same space that never went there before. That's my version of it. That's homospatial process. So whether you're talking about artistic creativity, where somebody brings in a new perspective artistically, a new sound musically, a new movement dance-wise, etc., it can manifest in terms of artistic creativity, scientific creativity, where you have Einstein, who comes along, studies Newton mechanics and realizes that there's these discrepancies, and eventually comes up with quantum mechanics and theories of relativity to explain what didn't work before. He came up with something new into a familiar space, and voila, there you have it. I mentioned earlier Carl Jung. He referred to creativity as holding the opposites. Holding the opposites. I think of it as a boy, I learned it from my parents. It's rubbing your tummy and petting your head. That's the way to think of the creative process. I like how Bob Dylan talks about it. Bob Dylan calls it going east on a westbound train. I had a professor in graduate school, a cultural anthropology professor, who said there's two kinds of people, Bob. There's lumpers and there's splitters. And he says, you have to be both. You have to be both. The lumpers are the ones that see the forest. The splitters are the ones that sees the trees. And I think the doctoral project, to be skillfully and successfully negotiated, requires being both a splitter. And I think the 4th chapter, as one example, involves a lot of splitting. And I think the 5th chapter involves lumping. And I think you have to do both. You can't get away with being one or the other. Many years ago in undergraduate, we studied Gestalt psychology, where we look at figure ground reversal. And so there you have it, that we're required to see both. Charlie Parker's up there playing saxophone, and that's also an attractive woman's silhouette, and they're both there. And the ability to go in and out of one and the other is what's required to pull off a doctoral project. You have to be able to skillfully move back and forth. One of my favorite poems, which I won't recite right now, ends with the line that we step back from the canvas. I think sometimes it requires, it's a significant discipline to be immersed in the specifics of a discipline, whatever you're studying, and then be able to step back enough. This would be chapter 4. Okay, what did I find? What did I find? What did I, like this? And then to be able to step back from it and see the forest, to be able to step back from the canvas and see what's the big picture here. I think this is one of the I'm sure this isn't a word. This is one of the geniuses, I'm going to say it. This is one of the geniuses of going through the doctoral project process, because I think it's a life project. I really see it that way. It's mental, it's academic, but it's also a life preparation that will serve you across your life, is this capacity to exercise different muscles at the same time. Let's move to the next key, which is key number 4. This is beginner's mind. A contemporary author says that all of the things in life that matter, including creativity, arise from beyond the mind. That's an odd thing to say in an academic institution, is that in order to complete your doctoral project, you also have to be able to get beyond your mind. Being mental isn't enough, or being mental will leave you mental. You have to find some way beyond that. But that begs the next question then. If I'm going through a doctoral project and Dr. Bob is saying I have to get beyond my mind in order to skillfully or successfully accomplish it, how do I get beyond my mind, and what does that look like? This last week in Time magazine, on the cover was the title article is The Mindful Revolution. And interesting, I mentioned Dan Siegel up the way in UCLA. He's mentioned and quoted in the article, as is Richard Davidson. And they have like a 5-step outline in there of how to, one way to achieve moving beyond the mind is, ironically, the title of the meditation is Mindfulness Meditation, is that there's a methodology for being able to let go of the constant, in the Eastern traditions they call it monkey mind, the monkey that swings from one branch to the next, and that whether you're a runner and move into the zone, I as a drummer move into this naturally through drumming, or you sit down and cross your legs or not and meditate using a mindfulness technique out of Time magazine. There are all kinds of skillful ways of being able to move below, move above, move out of that monkey mind. Years ago, I went to hear a psychologist, James Hillman, speak to a group of psychotherapists, and somebody asked him, what's the single most important thing to becoming a successful psychotherapist? And his response was immediate. I never have forgotten. And he said, it's to cultivate your art form. And he went on to amplify that, and he says, by this, I don't mean that you need to be an artist. If you're not a drummer, don't become a drummer. Okay. But find out what it is that moves you out of your constant, incessant thinking process. And I think what was implied in that moves you into the creative zone. And whatever that is, practice that regularly. And he says, you need to do that. That needs to be your first priority. And then secondly, you need to read everything that's ever been written in psychology. I liked his priority. In the East, they refer to what's created when we move out of that constant mental place. They refer to that, among other things, as the fertile void. I've always loved that term, the fertile void. That there's a void that really is fertile. I've done a fair bit of reading over the years in creative process and behavior and psychology. It's one of my pet interests as a musician myself. And the technical term used in the creativity literature in psychology for what is required in order to achieve creative product is, first of all, a lot of elbow grease, but secondly is what they refer to as incubation. And you can see in that term, incubation, just holding. And who of us doesn't know that? Trying to remember somebody's name or trying to come up with something that you forgot. And you just move into an incubation and it's provided. Well, it's the very same thing with the creative process, including navigating the doctoral project. I'll give you an example from just a few weeks ago. It wasn't so long ago that I was hammering away on all of these articles and books, and I was sitting with my partner Colleen at home, and it came to me as an aha moment over a piece of toast and some tea in the morning that I got it. I'd been reading about barriers to treatment in substance abuse, and the ones that I'd landed on particularly had to do with shame. I'd done a fair bit of reading and actually writing in shame before, and stigma. And so I was reading about this literature about shame and stigma. No one wants to be labeled as an alcoholic or an addict. And that's a huge barrier to admitting that one is suffering from this, much less seeking treatment. Reminds me of Woody Allen. He said, I don't know what it is, but I'm pretty sure it's not a compliment. You know? And so I was reading all this literature on shame and stigma, and I was also immersed in reading brain biology, reading about dopamine and reading about the opioid system and, you know, cortisol and this and that, whatever. And it came to me kind of as certainly it came to me as an epiphany. I looked at her and I said, you know what's crazy, honey, is that as I'm reading in these two areas, doing my left brain work, is that as I'm reading in the one area, namely in neurobiology, I'm realizing that it's exposing the stigmatizing attitudes I've had even towards clients that I've worked with over the years, and shame on me as a therapist. But I realize that the more that I read into the biology of addiction, the more is revealed to me that the shaming or stigmatizing attitude does not pertain. It's no longer relevant. In other words, there's a healing going on for me reading hard science. That's an example of incubation. That didn't come while I was reading it. It didn't come while I was reading a book called Molecular Neurobiology of Addiction Recovery. It took reading these books and then coming back and sitting down over some tea on a Sunday morning and then realizing there's something going on and I haven't been aware of it. It's crept up on me, but it took taking a break from everything, from the action, for that realization to set in. I think it's what we talk about in day-to-day life is just unplugging. I've always felt in academics the importance of unplugging, and I've probably modeled it poorly, so I own up to that. But I think I've always told students that if you're going to miss a class, just tell me. I'd rather you tell me rather than lie to me, and you can miss, if it's a semester, you can miss 2 classes and it won't affect your grade. And just tell me you're going to go skiing because I completely support that. And they go, you completely support that? And I go, yeah, it could be much more important than anything I was going to, probably is going to be more important than I'm going to say that day. Don't miss 3 classes. Because it'll affect your grade out of fairness to other students. But I absolutely meant that. And as students got that I was serious about that, it's about supporting unplugging or incubation. I love what the mindfulness meditation teacher, Jack Kornfield, says. He says, don't just do something, sit there. And so I think that there's value to beginner's mind, opening ourselves up. By beginner's mind, I mean clearing ourselves of the mind that is constantly, obsessively organizing, analyzing, and so on. With all due respect, there's another side, and we can get lopsided. Key number 5, I think it's important in moving through the doctoral project process that we teach others what we're doing. And I call it teaching to learn. I make a distinction between active versus passive learning. In the classroom, I've always felt this way, is that if students only sit in class and kind of absorb, take in material, in a passive, almost like a vacuum way, there's minimal generalization to real life. In other words, it might make it to the next exam if they're lucky, and then it will quickly go through the system and out of the system. Versus active learning, and I've always felt strongly about this and tried to practice this, is if I want to learn something, the best way I can learn something is teach you, Linda. Teach you, Tom, is to express it to you, and vice versa. There's an example that comes to mind. Yesterday here at Cal Southern, we had a all-staff meeting, and one of our administration came in and provided a group exercise to the room. And I thought to myself, there are a few things that sharpen the mind more quickly than being called on in public. And she made it clear that we had these group exercises to do and that we were going to have to report back about that. And I felt the difference from maybe a previous meeting where material was being given with no interaction being required. And in fact, if a question was put to the group, no one would respond because why should I? Barbara's going to respond. Why should I say anything? And now all of a sudden I had to interact with other people in a small group, and that we were going to be referring to the larger group. And maybe as painful as that was, I think that's an example of active learning, is that it requires your brain cells firing. It requires a commitment. It requires being on that kind of edge. I really think it's the way to incorporate what we're doing in the doctoral project process, to explain it. And I vote for being able to write technically, but also to explain in English. I really think there's value to be able to talk to your loved ones, your friends, your professional colleagues. If you're a clinician, it could be appropriate in a clinical situation. If you're working on something that's pertinent, I vote for explaining it to everybody, including the gas station attendant, if necessary, what you're doing, just to work out the stuff conceptually. Where I think if I can explain something simply, then I can explain it complexly. And I don't think it works the reverse necessarily. And so I really vote for being able to teach and really get into our bone marrow this material to where you know it by heart. I also want to suggest around this business of teaching to learn is that I think it's important, I think it's critical that you get feedback. And I think maybe significantly who you teach is you teach your advisor, you teach your doctoral project advisor and your committee members. You're teaching them this material and they're giving you live feedback. I want to say a word here about critical feedback. I think it's incredibly valuable and also very difficult to absorb. All of us have what psychology calls narcissistic vulnerabilities, and so it's hard to have somebody respond to the love of your life, your project, by criticizing and shaving off this and that and saying you need to redo this. And so we learn a lot about developing thicker skin or becoming non-attached, or however you want to put it. I came across a poem recently that brought to mind this process of moving through the doctoral project, being open to live feedback and valuing that. It comes from the 13th century Persian poet Rumi, who said, "Those who criticize me are only polishing the mirror." Isn't that nice? If I really have the attitude that your criticism only helps to polish this that I'm creating. And so I want to advocate putting it out there, and that means sharing with others what you're working on. Two more. Key number 6. I referred to this earlier. This is less is more. I'll be brief here because I've already touched on this earlier, but the idea here especially, I want to say this for the whole doctoral project. There's no reason to say in 2 sentences what can be said in 1 sentence. In fact, let me give you an example of it. Just this past Friday, I'm working on my next presentation of this material I'm working on right now, and I submitted myself to a discipline, and I found it really hard. I spent all day Friday taking it's broken into sections, so I'm going to say the whole thing is probably 40 pages long. But I was working section by section, so I would go like an 8-page section, and my goal was to take what I said and cut it in half. I've never done this before. I said, can I say everything I need to say in half as many words? I just about had a heart attack doing it, but I did accomplish it. Is that it's amazing, just for the discipline of it, wherever it lands, is that just to pare out everything that's non-essential, to really cut it down to the distilled kind of core. That's what I did on Friday, just to take the material to get it down to just that minimal bit. the term I came up for this, I told Colleen, I'm practicing subtracting today. Years ago, I subscribed to Modern Drummer magazine. I read an interview with the great jazz drummer Buddy Rich, and he said that the way to really learn a rhythm is to play it half as fast as you'd be inclined to. And so, and I think there's truth in that. I, as a drummer, can play something fast and probably messily, or I can slow it down to where I understand every nuance of what's going into that. And I haven't forgotten that, because there was no faster drummer than Buddy Rich. He says what supports that is being able to play so slowly, that business of subtraction. There's an ancient Chinese saying, and I'll just read it. In the pursuit of knowledge, every day something is added. Every day something is added. In the practice of wisdom, every day something is dropped. And I don't think that's a bad metaphor for moving through the entire doctoral project, but I want to say especially chapters 4 and 5, since that's my focus here today, is that chapter 4 around results, I mentioned this earlier, report only the results that are salient, that are relevant to your research questions, and report them in the cleanest language you can. Be sparse. And then secondly, in chapter 5, in the discussion section, this is a chance. I remember years ago chairing a dissertation where it wasn't I that said this, but I never forgot this. One of the committee members, who herself was a methodologist, commented on this student's discussion section. By the way, his dissertation was magnificent. I still remember it well. But she said his 5th chapter, at least the first version of it, she said it read like Tolstoy. I never forgot that image. Is that if you're Tolstoy, you write whatever you want to write, okay? But for a doctoral project, chapter 5 really, the move might be to make it more elaborate or more ornamental like Tolstoy, but save that for your first novel. It's really meant to be terse to the point. Even as you're being creative, you can be creative and zero in. And so less is more, less is more. Finally, all of us have seen this bumper sticker. I remember the first time I saw it however many years ago. Think globally, act locally. You know, the first time you see a bumper sticker or a sentiment like this, you actually think about it, you ponder it, and I did. Now it's so commonplace that we probably don't notice it or are bored by it, but I want to revivify it. I want to tie this into chapter 5. I really put the greatest store in chapter 5, the discussion section with implications, how it applies to my profession, what difference does this make, what are suggestions for future research. I feel like this is where we really do shine. If what I've studied, for example, right now I'm working on this business of shame and stigma and integrating neuroscience with the thought that this could be an addition to the literature, and my wish is that it could be useful clinically to those working with people that are in recovery from addiction, is that if there's something to this material, let's say that it has the capacity to transform a human life, that's not enough. What's required is the next step, is that which is transformative needs to be translated. And that's why it's imperative that the 5th chapter be written with ultimate attention. In the Bible, it talks about keeping your light under a bushel. Don't keep your light under a bushel. Find a way to express that light. Sociology has terminology for this. Sociology refers to that which is able to change. For example, a social group, it's referred to as authenticity. And the ability to communicate in sociology is referred to as legitimacy. And so what we're talking about is you've done this, your version of this. Now here's the transformative beam of light. Okay, now you need to legitimize it. Now you need to find a way to communicate it. And I think that chapter 5 is your parting shot, and that's the meaning and purpose behind that. That to me is the intrinsic motivation for doing a good chapter 5, is that now you get to pull together everything you've done in the previous chapters and all the reading you've done, all the work that you've done, and bring it to the streets. I think it also doesn't hurt to have some extrinsic motivation. And I want to reference earlier, I mentioned no wasted motion. I want to tell you that this is the title that I've developed for my presentation, Recovery Without Shame or Stigma, Contributions from the Neuroscience of Addiction. And I guarantee you, if you approach your doctoral project with this kind of, there's no other word for it, passion, what will happen is the next slide. I just got an invitation last week to speak at this national conference in October at this hotel. The Bellagio Hotel in Las Vegas. I don't think that external motivation is bad. You guys think that? I really I wouldn't have known this when I did my dissertation all those years ago. 35 years ago, I did a dissertation on mindfulness meditation. Now it's on the cover of Time magazine. There was a little bit of a time lapse there between what I did, and so it goes. But the fact is that this dissertation has served me for 35 years. I hope that you don't pick a doctoral project that doesn't matter to you. When I was in graduate school, there was the idea sometimes that just do a quick and dirty research study, Bob. That was the term, quick and dirty research study. And I had friends and acquaintances in graduate school that did that. And God bless them. You know, they got through. My dissertation took me 2 years, okay? Maybe they got through in a year, fine. But I have to tell you, for 35, going on 40 years, my research that I did in graduate school, my master's thesis at USC, this dissertation at Fuller, I can't tell you how it's influenced my career, both in terms of the content around mindfulness here. My master's thesis was in gerontology, but more than that was the discipline that I had to submit to achieve good research. It's influenced the way that I think, the way that I teach, even the way that I do clinical work. Is that what we're talking about is building a critically thinking, creative psychologist out of you going through our doctoral program, and I think that that's the genius. That's the spirit underlying the doctoral project in my mind. So let me quickly review what we've talked about here. Key number 1, no wasted motion. There's no wasted motion in this process. Key number 2, you've got to use your right and left brain. Key number 3, we're talking about a creative process, bringing things together that have never been brought together before. Be original. Okay. Key number 4, find a way to absent yourself of all that left brain thinking. Find a way to cultivate the empty spaces, because those will serve you when it comes down to writing on the printed page. Key number 5, take what you're learning and teach others. That's the best way to internalize it. Key number 6, less is more. Key number 7, to be able to think globally and act locally. I think that there's an ethical mandate or an ethical imperative embedded in a doctoral project. You have luxury that you may not have again in your career. In fact, most doctoral students don't ever have this luxury again, to devote these many hours, these many days, weeks, months, years to a single study, a single line of research. So when they complete that, I think it's incumbent upon them to take that out to the profession, take that out to clients that they see, take it out to community organizations. And that's what I mean here by think globally. Think big about what you've done once you've completed it and get it out there. Where do we go from here? I want to go back to Louis Pasteur for just a minute. The one who said in the fields of observation is that we have tons of resources in our doctoral program. As I mentioned, many of us sitting here today have worked together, labored over, revised our doctoral project manual. It's a living document. We already have more revisions planned next week and the following week. It's constantly living and growing. It's a gold mine for you, so I recommend that you learn it well. In the doctoral project manual, we have templates for completing every chapter of the doctoral project. We have outlines, every one of them. We've labored over the wording on that. We have rubrics, we have checklists. There are all kinds of resources, and let those be your guide and your conscience. You will be utilizing those with your doctoral project committee, including your chairperson. You'll be working through those, but there's a tremendous amount of resources in 40 or 50 pages. It's very condensed, and it's right there, and it's available to you. So I want to recommend, first of all, the doctoral project manual, our textbooks, which have been well vetted, and I recommend that you know these by heart. You'll find in the doctoral project sequence that you read these textbooks not once. I'm big on reading things twice, and I think we have to require you reading them 3 times. And you can decide to do that or not, but there's something about getting this material internalized. There's method to this madness, that we have you reading good textbooks again and again to where you really get that material inside. Let me mention, in addition to the chairs of our doctoral project committees and the committee members who are experts not only in psychology but research methodology, as well as many of them will have expertise in your chosen area of research, let me mention a resource that's really critical, and that's our university librarian. Jennifer Hill is a saint. She's enormously valuable. I have to tell you, in my work here at Cal Southern as curriculum developer, in my research, all of this, that Jennifer has been absolutely pivotal in terms of my acquiring articles. I'm in weekly conversation with her. She's a tremendous resource. There's nothing she loves more than to facilitate people's curiosity. So she's a tremendous resource. You've got to use her. Finally, our doctoral project bootcamp, which, thanks to Dr. Linda Fisher from USC, who's here in our presence today, has been, we've initiated it in the last year. We're coming up on our third doctoral project bootcamp just next week, and we hope to hold them biannually, twice a year. You have a concentrated immersion in all that we've talked about today, as well as Dr. Shaw's presentation. I think it's an unparalleled opportunity, really, in most any university outside of USC. Certainly, I've worked in a number of universities where there was nothing of this ilk, of this depth, of this concentration. And so you've got to put that on your calendar and prioritize the Doctoral Project Bootcamp. So any closing words? My last thoughts is that in addition to these resources, in terms of where we go, I would recommend a peaceful sunset or two. And this final quote from Oscar Wilde, I've slightly altered it, to remember that life is too important to be taken too seriously. Thank you.